Our final speaker in the session on the heart is Richard Levin, Chief Executive Officer of Coursera and former president of Yale University. And while he's getting set up, I'd like to give you a little update on the rest of our morning going into the lunch hour. Following Richard, Scott and Bob will be back, and they need no further introduction. And so please stay in your seat for that. And then following the etude, the fifth etude, the GoldLab Symposium has a little surprise for you. So please stay in your seats following the fifth etude, and then you'll be dismissed for lunch. Thank you very much.
Yes. So this has nothing to do with the heart, unfortunately, but Larry asked me to speak, so I want to thank you, Larry, for the opportunity to be with this very interesting group. And I also want to thank you, Larry, for scheduling Dr. Esselstyn after last night's delicious steak dinner. We would all feel very guilty if it followed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the glories and anxieties of the research university. I spent 20 years as the president of Yale, and I also am an economist, so this is sort of an economics talk about universities. And I will make that the primary focus of this talk, but since I have just within the last 4 weeks started a second career as the CEO of Coursera, the sort of pioneering platform in the development of massive open online courses as a way of disseminating information around the world, I will try to shorten this up a little bit so I can give you about 5 minutes at the end about the prospects for online education. So here's, we economists like to tell you what we're going to tell you, then tell you what we've told you. So I'm going to start by outlining what I'm going to say. First, what I think you all know, that research universities are a key source of America's economic leadership since World War II. Yet, today, our leadership is threatened, in part because the federal government support for research is both highly volatile and slowly declining, and state government support for its research universities has been eroding. And I'm going to conclude by pointing out that both public policy change and private sector responses are needed to fix this problem. The surprising conclusion is that healthcare has a lot to do with this, and that's what I hope to demonstrate. So let me first establish the argument about the university's contribution to American economic leadership. First, I think this one's pretty clear, that growing prosperity depends upon improvements in technology. This is the history of the modern world, but it also the cell phone in your pocket and the transportation by which you got here and the fact that we're living longer than we used to all have to do with improvements in technology. Technology depends on advances in basic science, and I think this is not an audience that needs persuasion on that point. But I have a favorite example to illustrate that point, which is a story of an applied physicist at Yale named Bill Bennett, who in the 1960s was experimenting with a phenomenon that was then called coherent light. He was doing purely curiosity-driven research at the time, and he was able to fashion and build in his laboratory an argon ion gas laser for the first time. He had no idea what its potential applications were going to be. The Defense Department, which funded his work, had some vague notion that this might be useful someday in weaponry, but they weren't very clear on how. And yet, this laser was invented by Bill Bennett. 35 years later, Bill Bennett had a detached retina. And how was it repaired? With an argon ion gas laser of the exact type that he invented 35 years earlier. So this illustration is good for demonstrating this point, that basic science is essentially a public good and requires public funding. Well, why is it a public good? Because at the time that the curiosity-driven research is undertaken, we very rarely have a notion of what the long-term future application of that knowledge will be. And Bennett example is a good one to illustrate the point that, you know, within 3 decades, lasers are used for thousands of purposes, industrial cutting, for all kinds of sensing technologies. This was, most of which was unanticipated at the time of invention. It's also the case that curiosity-driven research typically has results that are not just long-term, but also, well, as I say, unforeseeable. So the consequence is it's not easy for any single inventor to appropriate the returns from that basic knowledge. First of all, some of it isn't even legally patentable, because basic principles, scientific ideas, facts of nature are not patentable. And thanks to the Supreme Court, we now know that certain things that were thought to be patentable for a while, like genes or snips of DNA, are not patentable either, because they're now understood to be facts of nature, even though it takes some technology to unearth them and discover them. So the basic point is there's very little incentive for the private sector, for-profit enterprises to undertake basic research, because they aren't going to be able to get the benefits. It's going to diffuse, it's unknown, maybe a long time from now, and you can't own the discovery. So that's why the government needs to step in, and the government it typically supports basic science. Today, in the United States, about 60% of basic science supported directly by the government, another 10% by private foundations, another 10% by universities using their own internal sources of funding. And so that has been essentially the reason for public support for universities and the research done therein. In 1945, there was a really interesting report done for President Truman to try to establish the system of science that would prevail after the Second World War. Science had been obviously focused on weapons technology, principally during the war. After the war, Vannevar Bush, who was Dean of Engineering at MIT, authored this document many of you probably know about called Science, the Endless Frontier, and it laid down 3 principles for organizing the scientific system in the United States. First, that the government should be the principal funder of basic science, drawing on the point I just made. Second, that the principal locus of scientific research ought to be in universities, not in government labs, not in freestanding research institutes, but in universities, so that training of the next generation of scientists could be combined with frontier research. Lots of you work at universities as research scientists, and you understand why this is so important. If you isolate training from the frontier research, you're going to have a second-class next generation. And it's not just training the people who will be pioneers in research as the next generation. It's training the students who will go on and take industrial jobs and strengthen the human capital in those organizations. So that was principle number 2, and principle number 3 was that the government should not essentially micromanage the allocation of research funds. This is sometimes violated, but the basic principle was the government should decide what pockets of money, how much the pool will be in each scientific field, but the principal means for allocating the money, once you've decided how much is in each pot, would be peer review by experts rather than decisions by government bureaucrats. So the consequence of this rather radical, and by the way, completely different from the rest of the world, system of funding science is seen in the result, which is that America has led the world in the generation of new technology ever since that time. Illustration. Before the Second World War, Americans won 13% of the Nobel Prizes in science. I've eliminated here economics, literature, and peace, just chemistry, physics, and medicine prizes. After the Second World War, the numbers jump over the whole period to about 55%, and that percentage is still growing, slightly, but still growing, as seen by the bottom 3 rows. And note also that about a quarter of the Americans who win Nobel Prizes are born in other countries. Why? People come here to do science. And we know that because we see them in our graduate schools and we see them on our faculties. And stupidly, we don't see enough of them in Silicon Valley or in drug companies because we don't have high enough quotas on immigration for people that are trained here, and many go home. People want to be here. 77% of recipients of science and engineering doctorates, when questioned in their last year of study, want to stay in America. Fewer get to do that, but people want to. Another indicator of American dominance in science and technology is not the lagging indicator of Nobel Prizes, which of course measures what people did 20 years ago, but the contemporaneous indicator of scientific publications. And while our share of worldwide publications has slipped over the last few decades from about a third to about a quarter, we still retain an absolute stranglehold on the most frequently cited publications, where more than half of the top 1% of scientific articles measured by citations are done by Americans. So that demonstrates the point that we have a lead in science and technology. I guess one or two more illustrations. We have had for many, many years, about 5 decades, about 20% of the world's patents. That's not eroding. And of course, in terms of the impact of those patents, it's still the case that over half of the royalties received on patents in the world flow into America, or are paid right here in America. Okay, so, whoops, too soon. In this generally bright picture which I said, I talk about the glories of American research universities. In this generally bright picture, there are some causes for concern. The first is this kind of sawtooth pattern of funding, which sees huge spurts in government funding and then declines. And this is all measured in real dollars, inflation-adjusted dollars. You see that we had a huge run-up in the late years of the Clinton administration, the doubling of the NIH budget, and then a substantial real decline following that. Indeed, dramatic. The NIH budget today is, in actual purchasing power terms, is less than 85% of what it was in 2003. The sawtooth pattern creates havoc, as you all know, because what do we do when we get research money? We admit more graduate students, we train more PhDs, and then the bottom drops out and they don't get jobs. And that's exactly what happened in the last 15 years in America. It's a human tragedy as well as a waste of resources. The other source of erosion of support is evident here. It's not just that it's a sawtooth pattern, it's gradually declining, which, if you look at this, in the 1960s, R&D, the right-hand column, was essentially about 10.5% of the entire federal budget. Now, granted, we were doing the space program, we were making a huge investment in ramping up, but you see that there's been a steady erosion in the share of federal dollars going to R&D over the last 50 years, and interestingly enough, the defense budget has shrunk pretty much almost by the same proportion. It's about a third of what it once was as a share of federal budget. And where is the money going? Well, actually, a change in entitlements from 23.9% to 60% isn't Social Security. That's been pretty constant. It is all healthcare. Healthcare has basically soaked up the federal budget, and crowded out not only research and development, but also infrastructure investment and direct investments in education, and essentially every form of public investment, discretionary public investment. Kind of chilling story. And I guess it puts the onus on you in the healthcare sector and maybe on me as an economist. We have to figure out answers to this question because there's a lot more at stake than just the future of research, but really the future of the country. Now, there's another interesting twist, which is even state governments have had a similar problem. Now, let me just first of all say that state governments, of course, don't do much in the way of direct support for research, so the effect is more indirect. State governments, however, do subsidize education at their state universities, and state universities, this may be surprising, but maybe not here at University of Colorado where you maybe know this, but state universities do an enormous share of the federal research budget. Essentially, 60% of the Ph.D.s granted in the United States are granted in state institutions, and 2/3 of the federally funded research takes place in state universities. So what's the spillover? Well, the spillover is obvious. As state university budgets contract over time, they lead to reallocation of resources within the universities. So whatever discretionary money is around to support research tends to be affected as well. So you see here, it's not as quantitatively dramatic as the federal budget, but Medicaid has basically grown about 13.5 percentage points over the last 25 years of state budget, while higher education expenditures, K through 12 education expenditures, transportation, are all down by a couple, 2 or 3 percentage points of state budgets. That, by the way, people think there's literature out there that suggests it's the penal system that's soaking up state budgets, but that's not true, as you see from these numbers. That's pretty constant. So this has put enormous pressure, the decline, again, the rise in healthcare costs, putting enormous pressure on state educational institutions. And this has led to something sort of surprising, which is eroding the position of our public institutions. So here is a lot of information on this chart. Let me take you through it. But this compares four-year public institutions, four-year private institutions. And if you look over the last 30 years, you'll see that the published tuition and fees, that is the sticker price of university education, has been growing. This is all inflation adjusted. This is real growth by about 3% in private institutions and about 4% per year in public institutions. However, it's gotten worse in the last decade. That is, the private institutions have actually done a little better in holding down costs and are only now growing at about 2.5% per year, while the public institutions are now seeing their tuitions and fees grow by 5% per year over the last decade, particularly dramatic since the recession of 2008, an even larger effect. How does that translate to what it actually costs students to go? And here you have to recognize that there's often a lot of consternation about the high tuitions charged by the Ivy League schools and actually providing a price umbrella for other private schools that charge as much or almost as much. But what that neglects is that those institutions give away a lot in financial aid. So what you see over the last over this last 20-year period is that private institutions have actually only seen their net price, tuition minus financial aid, grow by 1.5%, while publics have seen it grow by 2.1%. There essentially was no difference in the 1990, the first 10 years of that period. In the last 10 years, there's been, because most of that period was prosperous, or first half at least, private institutions have actually essentially held net price flat. There's been no increase in the cost. Actually, at Yale, it's about minus 0.1% negative over that period in terms of the actual net cost to go to college. But the public institutions have not only raised tuition, as you can see by this, they've cut financial aid dramatically, so that the average cost of going to an institution like University of Colorado or Berkeley has been up almost 7% per year in the last decade. Depressing stuff. So what do we do about this? Well, there's some things that the federal government can do. One of them would be if you could find a way to bind Congress, to the mast of the ship and sail by the vicissitudes of budgetary pressures, you could try to maintain a steady trajectory. I mean, we would be so much better off with research expenditures by the federal government growing by inflation plus 1%, 1% real growth per year over the next 50 years than we would be over the Sawtooth, which nets out to the same result. But the Sawtooth pattern is really destructive of the long-term planning and the need to think longer term about the research we undertake, and of course because of the human capital we're both creating and then disadvantaged by the Sawtooth pattern. There are ways we could make research more efficient. There's been a lot of controversy. I'm on the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, and we did a recent study on the health of the science enterprise. There's a lot of sentiment out there in the scientific community that our system, which is heavily biased toward individual investigator grants of short duration, 3 years, that we could do better if we had more, particularly with younger scientists, if we allocated more to career awards, to longer-term grants that were not project by project, which of course give tremendous incumbent advantages because you can use the last year of one grant to fund essentially the preliminary work to write the next grant, and that's not an advantage that everyone can capture. So one of the things we could do is have fewer project grants, more career awards, more longer-term awards. And here's my favorite idea, which is if you look at the history of government influence on technology, and hence our prosperity, the real heyday was the 1950s and 60s when the government basically did more to advance research by buying the output than the actual direct funding. So this was mostly defense and space technology. But the government paid high prices for new things, way higher than the market would bear. Early radios, communications devices, propulsion systems, and so forth, all financed by the government at costs greater than the eventual market costs. You got the learning experience by producing for the government, and then you could offer things, spin off technology to the market at much lower prices. This is a great strategy, and we use almost none of it today. Think about energy technology. If we were smart, the government would buy only electric cars. It would find ways to make its own purchases of electric power for its own use all green. I mean, there are ways you can lead the movement of technology by creating the market and allowing technologies to scale up. So I think that is another way we could get more bang for our research dollars if, in fact, we supplemented it with procurement policies. In this political environment, the chances of this happening are 0, but it's worth keeping on the agenda for future consideration. And then, of course, the big one. I mean, what is it? What could we do to really fix the problem of unstable and eroding support for our research universities? Fix the healthcare problem. I don't have any bright ideas about that. I leave it to you. It's obvious, though, the solution is certainly not all technological, as many of the speakers at this conference effectively illustrate. Lots of really great life-saving technology is very expensive. The trick, I think, and I think most people would agree, is organizing the healthcare system in ways that are more efficient and probably avoiding excessive expenditure in late stages of life when the odds of survival are small and when all that intervention is doing is keeping people alive for a few more months. But that's a real hard one, and that's going to take a social consensus developing around medical care that's not easy. There are some things that universities themselves can do, and this is sort of the lead into the next segment. And one is both to reduce the cost and enhance the revenue through the use of technology. So I think I've got time. If I may, I'll digress here to talk a little bit about what online education can do to help universities. Now, there's been a lot of talk in the past couple of years with all the publicity given to this newly arising sort of sector of the educational world, that somehow the online education is a hugely disruptive technology and it's going to actually supplant the residentially based university sometime, very quickly. And I hear my humanities professor colleagues are incredibly nervous that hard enough as it is to get jobs for their graduate students, there will be zero in the future because the technology will take over the teaching. I actually think this is pretty far-fetched, and I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, and it isn't happening yet. I mean, what is happening, though, is something very different. I mean, let me say, stop there for a minute, go back. People are using, a certain number of early adopters are using online video to supplement what they do in a classroom, the so-called flipped classroom. Watch a video, then come to class and let's talk about it. But that's really no different than having a textbook and telling people to read the textbook and come talk about it. To the extent it replaces the lecture, the 50-minute nonstop talking as a mode of instruction, it's replacing the most inefficient form of human communication that we know, right? Retention is very low. A 50-minute lecture is actually much better for 6-minute snippets. But we'll leave that aside. The point is, so far, the online technology may be making teaching better in our universities, it's not replacing it. But where there is a tremendous impact, and I think hugely promising one, is this technology and what Coursera is doing and edX, its rival, are effectively changing the game about what the university's mission is. I mean, in broad terms, universities are here to create knowledge through research and to disseminate it through publication and teaching. Well, how do we disseminate publication today? We write research results up for very narrow, specialized audiences, for the most part, and we teach an elite, highly selected, extraordinary group of students who have the privilege of going to one of the great universities in the world. But the people we teach number in the thousands per year, per class cohort, even in the biggest universities, maybe 10,000. And in a way, that's the limit of the fruits of all this investment in human capital, all of you professors in this audience, your impact in terms of forming the knowledge base for the next generation is pretty much limited to these people that are in your classroom. Well, now what if the numbers of people in your classroom can be expanded by 2 orders of magnitude? So that instead of teaching a class to 50, you're teaching a class to 5,000. Instead of teaching a big lecture course to 300, you're teaching 30,000. That is what Coursera is doing right now. It's taking the great teaching of the great universities and reaching audiences of that scale all over the world. And they're not students in second-tier universities. That's not who's taking these courses. They're people who are not in the university system. So it's broadening the access to great teaching to a much wider population. 70% of Coursera students are outside the United States. A third are in developing countries. Many are post-college age. Many do have college degrees. More than half have college degrees. But they're either improving their personal growth, learning about subjects they're interested in, pursuing their passions, and thus, enriching the human spirit. Or they're very practical, and people are getting job-relevant employment skills, retooling. If you're a computer programmer, the way you're going to learn new programming languages in the future to keep up to date are by these online courses. We're seeing lots of examples of that. We're seeing Silicon Valley companies pay their employees to take these free online courses because they enhance their job skills. We're seeing young men in Africa taking the Wharton course in accounting and getting jobs at Big Four accounting firms. There's amazing stuff going on. And now, how does that translate to saving the research university? How does it translate to making Coursera sustainable? We're going to have to charge for something. And that revenue will be split between the providers like Coursera and edX and the universities who create the content. Right now, I would say there are only probably a handful. So what are we doing now? The business model is charge $50 for people who want a verified certificate that they've taken the course. The basic course is free. You want to be verified by keystroke analysis and video camera, web camera, that you're the authentic person taking this test. You can pay $50 and get a certificate. Maybe that price will go up to $100, but I think the spirit of this is to keep the price low and keep it accessible and affordable around the world. But with the scale we can achieve, potentially, this could be a very viable source of revenue for universities, and could have an impact on their viability as well as the providers. It's not, this whole movement of massive online courses is only 2 years old, and we're already talking about, at a given moment in time, Coursera has about 800,000 active users. We've serviced about 7 million people in 2 years. That number could easily grow by a factor of 10, and you'd really have something going. Right now, there are only about 4 courses that have produced, no more. There's about 7 courses so far out of our 650 that have produced enough revenue to the universities to cover the cost of producing these courses, average about $50,000. But if the scale grows by a factor of 10, it could really be a viable thing. I'm excited about it. I've moved from one extreme, an institution that teaches the most highly selected, the most privileged people, and gives them an enormous amount of personal attention. Very high ratios of faculty to students. Most students at Yale, the average class at Yale has an enrollment of 12, I believe, in median class. So you get a lot of attention. So from one extreme to the other, which is try to educate the world and try to make the impact of the professorate greater than ever before in human history. It's exciting. Glad to be here. Happy to take your questions.
We have a few minutes for questions. Way in the back.
Around finding new revenue sources through the use of technology. So you can give us some insight into things to think about.
The new revenue source I was suggesting are these online courses. Oh, well,
Are there other ways that you could use technology to actually impact the healthcare changes we see?
Well, I actually think the solution to the healthcare problems I was suggesting, I don't think is principally technological. I think it's principally organizational and organizing the system for efficient delivery and essentially rationing certain forms of healthcare that we don't really do now because of the third-party payments system that we have in place. So obviously there are lots of ways universities can enhance their revenues through their spinning off companies in their local area, but people have been doing that for a long time, and that may be that's already one of the factors that have gone, that despite which we have still had rising costs in the sector.
Question
Yep.
yet?
Yeah.
Anna?
So you talked about how Silicon Valley companies are actually paying their employees to take these courses. Your business model is very interesting, and it's kind of in flux. Have you explored the idea of actually reaching out to the private sector to be paying into?
Yeah, business model number 2 is actually layer on, we're really committed to the principle that the base layer, that is the lectures and videos and quizzes, be freely provided. But we also are talking with some companies about doing their own, closed session on top of the open content, where we would provide more sort of a technology base for them to do, small group instruction, more interactivity, and then pay more for that. So that, yes, that is an obvious avenue for us and for the university partners.
I think you touched up on what my question is, but reaching out to a broad group is part of the equation. The other one is really the interaction that happens at, let's say, an elitist place like Berkeley or Stanford, where you have peers that really contribute to your learning. So
Absolutely.
what are the plans? Or I think you have an opportunity to do that there.
Yeah.
But what are the plans to actually do this on a broader?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say, it's going to be incredibly hard to replicate the experience of 4 years at a great institution like Berkeley or Stanford or Yale or Princeton. I mean, you just don't, what? Or CU. Absolutely. You just don't, the being in the peer group and having the day-to-day interaction with young people whose lives are changing, what a great thing to do to 18 to 22-year-olds at that formative stage of their life, to bring them together and let them learn from each other and have shared experiences. That's going to be very hard to replicate over the internet. And also the personal interaction. I mean, think about why those of us that are academics, and I think it's a majority, why did you choose this path? You probably chose this path in life because one or several charismatic, professors inspired you, and that kind of personal touch, is lacking to a considerable degree in the technology. Now, we can promote interactivity. Right now, the courses have threaded discussion forums, that are, so people do interact online. We're seeing already self-organizing small groups, people with a particular interest in a particular online course say, we're going to create this chat room for us, or some of us would like to get into a Google Hangout and actually see each other by video. So we will facilitate that kind of more intense interaction as we build it out. There's actually a little bit it's interesting, there's a lot of challenges here. The cohort phenomenon is important for some learners, but we also see that a lot of people drop out of these courses because of the rigid time schedule. So if you're a working professional, you may necessarily want to complete a course in 8 weeks. So we're actually rolling out an alternative starting this month, which is start the course anytime you want and do it at your own pace. It has a great advantage and it'll attract more people. Disadvantage, and it makes it much more difficult to create cohorts that are learning together.
One last question. But you don't care about time, so you can ask it. And then we'll take you over here because you haven't had a chance.
So the striking thing you said in the beginning was this report in 1945 that defined the way the next 50 years were going to go. Right. And when I look at, without casting aspersions on anybody except the director of the NIH, it seems as though that the NIH has made a fundamental error by funding the intramural program in a way that is about control over the extramural PI-initiated work. And then a group that I admire more, Howard Hughes, did the same thing. They didn't ask me, but they built Genelia farms as a way of doing something at scale, which I suppose is the positive way of thinking about it. Do you think those things are human-driven to control or good?
Yeah, well, I think there's a bureaucratic tendency to want to build things that you can control, and it's unfortunate because it's pretty clear, looking at the history of the last 50 or 60 years, that the output from the distributed work that's taking place in universities is more prolific and more important than what's coming out of national labs or their variations in intramural research at the NIH. I mean, if you think the NIH is bad, the Department of Energy is even worse, where the national labs on the whole have just not produced in the way that they once did, you know, but it's bureaucratic, you know, tendencies tend to overwhelm. I mean, better to let the marketplace of ideas flourish in lots of decentralized locations.
One more quick question.
Yes, in relationship to how the Coursera and its cousins are going to help finance universities with additional revenues, it seems they're just as likely, and I would like you to see if you can expound on this, to displace existing revenue streams if high-quality content can be derived virtually free. And so how does that balance struck?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So we already see, you know, concerns, particularly in professional schools that offer, you know, professional education online now for high prices. So business schools and medical schools, notably, which have there's continuing medical education courses that are significant revenue streams to some medical schools, and even more in the business school world, where there's executive programs that people pay a lot of money for, even the online ones. So yes, potentially some of that could get displaced, but what we're seeing in the early stages is almost the opposite, which is, and there's limited evidence so far, but if we take the University of Pennsylvania, Wharton has courses online now on Coursera that are first-level courses in accounting and finance and marketing and entrepreneurship. And what they're discovering at Penn, at Wharton, is that now half of the applicants, or half of the people actually admitted to their online degree programs have taken a Coursera course that was the lead generator. So, I mean, people found the programs by taking the Coursera courses. So it could be that there'll be a positive impact too, that more people will be driven to these higher priced alternatives by you know, it's going to cut both ways, there's going to be both effects. But
Thank you very much, Dr. Levin.
okay, thanks.